I handle all the research for a lot of the products, as well as the content, the efficacy engineering, and the threat hunting program. Now, today I'm not going to be talking to you about the managed threat hunting program that we conduct, but more appropriately, following on with Ben's presentation surrounding XDR, I'm going to be talking about threat hunting, as depending on which way you go in terms of your positions with XDR and what analysts you pay attention to or read, threat hunting is a prerequisite to that. So let's talk about what threat hunting is. It's not a new thing. In fact, it's been around for as long as I can remember in the industry, and I've been here for 20 plus years. It was really born out of boredom, right? The abundance of time that we all have throughout the industry and our day-to-day lives. It came from a lot of the defenders, a lot of the incident responders and forensic investigators when they had a few spare cycles to actually start looking at things beyond the active cases or the incidents that they were working on. What threat hunting comes down to is an analyst-centric approach to unsurfacing these threats that may have been missed by traditional methods of automated detection or the controls that we have implemented. Now, we have to ask ourselves, why might those controls or products have failed us? Well, it really comes down to our ability to detect things, our ability to handle the pipeline of content, and a differentiation between detections, preventions, and telemetry sources. Back in the 90s, I first encountered some nation-state threat actors for the very first time. I was kind of taken aback by it, by how they moved throughout the network and some of the things that they conducted and how they did it. You couldn't really distinguish between what our system administrators were doing and what these threat actors were conducting. And when you start thinking about detection engineering, this really makes it very difficult to start applying that level of logic and differentiating, absent some of the organizational context, absent, being there and being able to maybe apply granular levels of filtering to the detections that we're writing or the detections that we're using as customer. Now, one of the big things when it comes to threat hunting is there is a prerequisite level of knowledge that you have to have. This is twofold. One is on the organizational context side, and the other one is just technology. What we often find is with anything that is new and getting prioritized focus, there's a big urge for everybody to jump in. It's the cool kid at the school. But I caution everybody to, take back or sit back and think considerably about how they enter into threat hunting. What I mean by that is we have a lot of college programs, certificate mills coming out that allows us to get certified, maybe take a test, read a book, and everybody wants to jump into threat hunting. They all want to unsurface that nation state or threat actor. And that's fine. That can totally be done. But we have to think about as we go on, as we introduce threat hunting to our organization, we need a level of maturity and process to ensure the most success for those new folks. So when we are jumping into threat hunting, when we are looking at hiring processes, we have to ensure that we've got some pretty significant knowledge and some pretty significant subject matter experts and people that have been around and seen that organization for quite a while to ensure that we have a comfortable mentoring program to aid some of these new folks that are coming into that industry and jumping straight into the thick of it. Now, when we think of threat hunting, we can kind of broadly lump these things into about four distinct categories. We have our indicators of compromise, our curated indicators, anomaly detection, and hypothesis-based hunting. At the top, we're really going to be focusing on tools, tactics, techniques, procedures, but this really gives us a more narrow set of visibility. As we move down, we have a broader set of visibility, and this introduces a few issues that we have to be really conscious of as we're introducing threat hunting into our organization. When we're thinking about indicators of compromise, most often, these are atomic in nature. What I mean by that is their IPs, domains, and hashes, typically found at the end of our threat intelligence reports. We grab them, we search them without much thought or consideration. Oftentimes, we should stop and ask ourselves, is this indicator maybe relevant? What is the context behind it? Funny enough, just this morning, I saw a bulletin, and one of the indicators of compromise was listed simply as a Python execution. It was quite literally Python exe spawning a process. Now, if you were to go and search for that indicator of compromise without the context, you're probably going to get a number of hits. You're going to find a lot of things. That doesn't mean that there's a threat actor on every system or even every system in the server farm. We have to think more focusedly about these. Our next level up is curated indicators of compromise. These are a little bit more pronounced. They're a little bit more focused, maybe specific to our industry. When we step back down to that foundational level of indicators of compromise, and we start thinking about these threat actors that were utilizing a command and control infrastructure that leveraged an IP address, well, what was that threat actor doing? Were they targeting our vertical? Were they even targeting what we have in terms of software deployments or maybe mobile OSs? Curated indicators give us a little bit more insight and a little bit more focus based on those atomic elements going a little bit further. One of their shortcomings, however, is that they really don't give us one of the benefits that we have within threat hunting, and that is surfacing up, visibility gaps or gaps in our controls. This is really important. We'll talk about this down the road in a few moments. Moving up an additional level, we have anomaly detections. This is where you start getting into a level or layer of data aggregation, data sciences, perhaps even applying, I hesitate to say machine learning because everybody wants to throw machine learning at every single problem. And I'm more reluctant to do that. I'm a firm believer that typical or standard data science practices, even stacking, aggregates, deduplication methods can be applied and give us a significant value when it comes to threat hunting. And you will need to get to a level where you're able to apply anomaly detections and simple data sciences because there is a lot of data. Even on a small organization, there's a significant amount of data. Finally, our hypothesis-based hunting is where I love to play. It's where we can sit there, think about these possible scenarios, solutions, really dig into threat intelligence, and all sorts of context surrounding threat, known actors, what they're doing, what they could be doing, and start looking for that. In my opinion, the hypothesis-based threat hunting gives us the biggest bang for our buck. When we think about organizational maturity, David Bianco I can't say it as good as David Bianco, who a few years ago wrote a paper outlining the maturity evolution of threat hunting. Realistically, he is probably the founding father of threat hunting, at least in the formal process and outward communication. I believe he's currently working at Target. He's always speaking at SANS, always has great insight. So I had to steal the maturity model to highlight this. Most often, when we look year over year at the SANS hunting surveys that come out, what we find is that there's some pretty good evolutions and growth that is going on within the formal context of threat hunting. But we still have a large number of organizations that are starting out they're starting out, right? They're starting out at level 1 or level 0. They have to start somewhere. And the problem, realistically, with our initial entry into threat hunting is it's often reactive, right? People label the threat hunts that they're performing as just responding to automated alerts. But that's not threat hunting. That's being a reactive force. That's being an investigator. That's following a lead or a product evolution. So as we start moving through over the years, what we find is that we're increasing our telemetry sources, we're refining our processes, we're being more proactive in our actual search for threat actors. Somewhere in the middle, we realize, and I've seen this several times, we messed up in a few areas, whether that is how we're collecting data and storing it, maybe how we're indexing it, Perhaps even some of the processes have been surfaced that were lacking or just aren't working. The important part is to iterate on these processes. They're never one and done. You can't come out of the gate, and I don't expect anybody to, just come out of the gate and be ready to go. Moving through, we can finally get to a state where we have these mature processes. A lot of our telemetry collection or processes are automated. Now, this has taken us in Cisco, with all the resources that we have, a few years to perform and get to that maturity level, and then offer that as a service. What we find for most typical organizations is that when you factor in just personnel for an 8-person ramp up at an average cost of about $250,000 to the organization or company per person, that's including medical and all that, and a few juniors, you're looking at $1.8 million investment just for people. This is including your infrastructure. That's not including any turnover, any software that you need, any processes. It's really not taking into account, any of your data scientists who, depending on geolocation, might or might not be more expensive. So one of the things that we can do is jump into a managed provider that while we're building this, we can adequately get coverage and adequately get somebody to supply our more mature process of hunting. And we can feed off of that. We can build off of that and learn off of it. But where do we start maturing? I go back to process, thinking about our process, our methodology, our starting points, and refining that. What we learned very early on is just releasing somebody out there to haphazardly search our data sets was not going to work in a long run. And that was very early on in the form of, just sending somebody out saying, find evil. It was far too broad of a classification or request. We have to have our starting points, and there's a variety out there to choose from. There's so much knowledge and so much standardization frameworks that exist between our MITRE, our Verizon reports, even some of the content that's released, very often on SANS. And we have to start applying that to a formal plan and process. As part of that process, we also have to think in organizational context outside of just our little hunting team. We have to think about coordination with our security operations, with our defenders, with our incident responders. And one of the often overlooked pieces that we have to have those relationships with is HR. We'll kind of go into that in a moment, but I want you to think about that for a second. Why do we need an HR relationship? When we're applying our methodology, we're going to be surfacing not just threat content. We're going to be surfacing a lot of different things. And we need to have this process to formalize that, to make sure that we're taking all of those observations and getting them back into our deployment, in our defenders' hands, and then also learning as we evolve. Several years ago, I was on an American Airlines flight heading back home, and I picked up one of the, probably COVID-laden magazines now in the back of the seat that nobody touches. And I found an article with a book recommendation or book review called A More Beautiful Question. I've read that book every year now, and it's the foundation for almost everything I do, down to the requirements and crafting things that I'm building. And I applied that to threat hunting, because every threat hunt, every good hunt starts with a question. Should this be occurring? Should this process be executing in this manner or communicating to the network? And this is where reaching back into that education and experience component that I spoke about earlier comes into play. We're going to spin cycles and spend a lot of extra time, digging in and investigating some of these questions if we don't have some foundational knowledge. At this point, I can look at a lot of telemetry and go, okay, yeah, that's just a systems management server. That is normal. That is, part of the regular process of loading up your web server. But when we're new in that field, when we're new to that telemetry, we're going to see everything. And when we're actively pursuing threat actors, you want to see these things because that's what you want to find. The most interesting of these questions was Notepad, right? My original hypothesis, and again, this is where, I've been in this industry doing a variety of jobs for 20 years. My first assumption was that Notepad does not connect to the network, that if we just wrote a hunt for that, we would be finding pay dirt. And my assumption was that people would be injecting into the Notepad process and utilizing that. Well, as it turns out, we can't have nice things because quite a number of users actively open up text files from network shares directly from the network share, which causes Notepad to immediately connect to that network. So this presents a challenge, of course, when you're not in that organization, when you're, kind of on the outside looking in, of how do I contextualize that? But a lot of these questions are often fun, often the basis of our hunts. Now, a moment ago, we talked about the indicators of compromise. Now, they still have value, right? But they're limited in value. Just because we search for an IP address or a hash or a domain, and we don't get a trigger, does that mean that the threat actor didn't impact us, didn't attack us? Did we just get lucky and they forgot about our industry or our company? No. We have to take it a step further and dig into the intelligence that provides us a level of context and provides us other avenues to hunt against. And this is what we start getting into as we mature our internal processes and capabilities. We start extracting and broadly labeling this content towards some type of framework alignment, be it MITRE or anything else, and identifying this content such as miscellaneous persistence mechanisms, certain command execution chains, certain activities to go and search for. One of the important elements when aligning to a framework that I would suggest is don't stay within the framework. What I mean by that is just because a threat actor might use credential dumping with one way, that doesn't mean that they're always going to use it that way, or they're always going to conduct it in that manner. There's probably about a dozen different ways to dump credentials or inject into a process. We have to go and hunt and recursively hunt and better hunt against every different avenue. We use the framework as a basis. We use the intelligence to enrich that basis and hypothesis, and we get more to hunt against. When it comes to hunting, there's probably more than 5 outcomes, but I found this slide and I loved it, and I wanted to highlight the 5. So first and foremost, we're going to find security incidents. That is, after all, what we are hunting for, what we're actively seeking. And this is not necessarily the best outcome, but for a hunter, it's what you're getting paid to do. Find these security incidents, finding the adversaries on the network that haven't been discovered. We're also going to find gaps in our controls, gaps in our capabilities, detections, our content, our coverage. And remember, I mentioned the relationships that we need to have. HR is an important one because you're going to find some things that are pretty common, whether they be password violations, data access, violations, things like that. One of the most uncomfortable experiences that I've ever had was when we accidentally found child porn. And we had to have those relationships, not only with HR, but also with legal, and processes defined not only to handle that, both from a forensic and legal perspective, but then also how do we get the support for our hunters, for our investigator, for our responder that encountered that by accident. Now, it wasn't the intention of the hunt, but it did surface. It was a reality. And sometimes you're going to find things that are very uncomfortable. And you have to think about that from an HR perspective of getting our defenders the support they need, because it's not something you can shake off on a Tuesday and come back in on Wednesday, especially when it comes to that topic. One of the other outcomes that we're going to find is new intelligence. We have to take all these findings, all these incidents, anything that is atomic and usable, and leverage that, whether that's sharing it with the industry, sharing it with partners, or just sharing it with other teams. Again, our security operations, our defenders, our incident responders, and forensic investigators. We're also going to come out with some of these use cases for detection logic. Our products, again, aren't the end-all be-all, and what we have deployed, we often have this level expectation, or some of us have this expectation that it's just going to protect us. Once we set it, we forget it, it's there. But we also have to be ready and capable within the products that we have and the capabilities that we have at our disposal, whether it's going back to Ben's XDR or SIM. We have to be able to leverage our findings in the further protection of our organization. And oftentimes, a hunt doesn't necessarily produce anything, but it's really important to document it. What we've had many instances of is we've conducted a hunt. We didn't have any hits. We didn't have any findings on any of the organizations we ran it against. We documented what we did, what we were looking for, put it away. And then a few months later, we had somebody new come in, rotate onto the team, take a look at that as part of the process, and say, hey, there's a different way to do this. And as soon as we adjusted some queries, sent it off, lo and behold, we found something. So it's always important to include within the process a revisiting of some of our old hunts that did and did not have any type of outcomes. So what does success look like? We had a hunt not too long ago for basically monitoring any instances of activity spawning from web servers, be it your Windows web servers, patches, all the variations. And we're looking for sequences of commands and other activity. And what we found was really interesting. It turned out there was actually, at least one component of it was caught by antivirus. But what do we often do with antivirus alerts? They have so much volume, we just overlook them, right? We don't handle them. Maybe they're medium, maybe low, maybe even a high, but it's an antivirus alert. We just assume that a quarantine was done and we move on. But what we found was the Windows web server started spawning an execution of Who Am I, right? Followed within 30 minutes of that enumeration and privilege escalation, it started moving laterally. It started going and moving throughout the organization in less than an hour from when it actually landed. So one of the things we noticed as we were investigating this was that it was one of the components anyway, was convicted by that antivirus. But it was amazing to us that within 1 hour's time from from exploitation to enumeration to lateral movement. It's 1 hour. The clock is closing, and that's why we can't wait on defense posture. We can't wait on resolving or waiting around, and triaging a lot of these alerts. We need the products to help us prioritize these things. We need to act fast. We've seen a lot of the ransomware threat actors actually move down in their timeline. Ryuk, a few months ago, earlier in the year rather, they were operating on a 3-week time window. More recently, threat actors have moved it up to 24 hours from initial compromise to enumeration to lateral movement to ransoming the organization. Now, threat hunting isn't in real time, but with a mature process, we can start to supplement and find some of these things and surface them up in a far quicker manner. Another hunt that we performed was looking for privileged commands and parent chains. And you always find some interesting things. Sometimes, rather eyebrow raising and turns out to be benign. Other times you look at it and you know it's not supposed to be occurring. In this particular instance, this came out of our data stacking, and we saw that LSAS process, which handles all of your credential access and communication with your Active Directory control or Active Directory domain controller, authentication mechanisms, things like that, was actually executing commands. And in this instance, it was launching the MSI exec process, which is commonly used for installers. And it was all running this in the context of system. When we started looking a few moments later down the telemetry stream upon that investigation, we found that it was rotating through these IP addresses, downloading a executable, which was mislabeled. So you find a lot of really interesting items where, just a detection method for command execution, right? There's so many variations, so much variety that is difficult to produce a consistent and fully inclusive detection for something like that. Finally, let's talk about what those benefits are. I want to summarize the entirety of the presentation with that. There are probably more benefits to threat hunting than just those mentioned. And we see some of the SAM survey results year over year. These numbers seem to be increasing, but there's definitely the attack surface reduction. You're going to find different things, control failures. You're going to find segments on your network that you thought were secure or thought were implementing a certain thing that are in fact not. This is a great way to also identify those gaps and verify some of that coverage. One of my favorite hunts, one of my favorite findings, unfortunately, I just didn't have the screenshots with some of that data or couldn't consolidate it the best I could, was we had a segment of a network that was supposed to be 100% encrypted. All traffic on this should have been encrypted. And the hypothesis was simple. There should be 100% encryption. We start looking at some of the network telemetry, and lo and behold, we start seeing some IRC traffic. And when we started looking into it a little bit more, we found that somebody had accidentally plugged a server into that network, which was not only unmanaged, it was significantly out of date and facing the internet. So it was compromised, probably by about 5 different actors, and serving as a command and control server with its own IRC. So we found this whole thing was compromised through a content management server. We had 5 different admins on it, 5 different threat actors. And that was just attack surface, gap in coverage, unmanaged system, policy violation. I mean, that was every single benefit that you could think of, all wrapped into one. We're going to find threats to the business. We're going to identify these policy violations, uncover illegal activity. One such instance for illegal activity, crypto mining. It's really big, right? And a lot of employees think, oh, you know what? I can just throw this little box in or run this software on my work system, get some free electric, free processing cycles. It's not what's that old software, SETI at home, right? We're not looking for aliens. It's not low CPU counts. It's not low resource. Just recently, the Suffolk County government identified a individual who was running their networks and actually was running a $4,000 to $6,000 a month Bitcoin mining operation. So that's one of those things where you're going to start seeing that anomalous behavior, legal activity, coverage, attack surface, all of those things wrapped in one. But I leave you with these benefits. I leave you with some of the positives that people have found out of it. I encourage you to go out there and threat hunt. Get a few cycles, get some spare time if that's a thing that actually exists. I don't think it is. Everybody's busy now, so more than ever. But think about threat hunting and what it can do for your organization. And if your organization is not currently threat hunting, I greatly encourage you to start moving towards that. Start somewhere, mature it, and get yourself to a great place because there's wonderful benefits that come out of it. With that, I'll open up the floor for any questions.
Yeah, I got one. Have you ever seen a company who refuses to do threat hunting because you might actually find something? Because I have.
Yeah, it is a thing, right? And it's just the same as penetration tests where when you think about compliance, right? I had a penetration test that I was doing years ago. It was a PCI compliance. They said, well, we have 2 servers that are responsible for processing that. So instead of just scoping out the entirety of their network, which had pivots, had access to all of that, they gave us 2 servers, literally 2 IPs that had 2 interfaces, both of them HTTPS, because they didn't want us to unsurface anything. They didn't want us to uncover anything. They simply wanted to check that compliance box and move on. I think when it comes to organizations that are averse to threat hunting because of the fear that they're going to find something, we have to work through that fear with them. We have to help them understand the benefits and understand the implications if they're compromised and what that means not only for their bottom line, but for their data, for their customers, and then everybody else. All right. At the end of the day, we're protecting multiple dimensions every day as defenders. We have to think about not only our organization, but our company, the personal data that all of our company's employees have somewhere. There's a lot of it. And we have to think about the customers and the net impact to them and the trust, right? So I think realistically, that's just working through that with that customer and making them understand this is the importance.
When you do threat hunting, what's the most overlooked item or resource that you use to find a threat? Overlooked by normal security tools or just by anybody, really?
Yeah, so I mean, the one we use the most, because I think it's the richest source of telemetry, is endpoint telemetry, right? But realistically, when you get down to it, you don't even need an EDR to do threat hunting. You don't need, all the latest whiz bang things. There's been numerous presentations highlighting the value of Sysmon and the data that comes out of there. If I had to get down to it, it would be 2 things that were significantly overlooked. The Sysmon data, which really just piggybacks into the event data, but the event data, right? Getting the event logs and having the event logs. I'm amazed at how many companies just don't have event logging enabled. And the ones that do are often under some compliance mandate, but they don't really have a process for ingesting it, reviewing it, processing it, and utilizing that within any type of model for threat hunting or active triage. And it's kind of crazy the amount of data and the visibility that presents, and yet the lack of utilization that it actually has.
So a follow-on to that one is, how do you determine blast radius? So if you
repeat the question.
How do you determine blast radius? So if you do find a threat, how big of a blast does that have? How do you determine that blast radius?
Yeah, so it really depends on, I guess, the contextualization of that threat. What has that threat done? Where is that threat impacting? And this is where the risk modeling that you incorporate within your organization or have for your organization comes into play, right? It's one of the real tough things to say, okay, is Steve, who works at the front desk, who's running this PowerShell command, is that part of his job? Is that really the most critical threat? Or is Debbie, who works IT, running a similar PowerShell command, is she the threat? No, well, we have to balance that. Where are they actively targeting? Oh, both of them are communicating to the CFO system. Well, what Debbie might be doing an IT op on that or an investigation, Steve at that front desk should not be talking to the CFO system. We have to think about that, what policies, what kind of groups and organizations that we have for our company. We have to think about who should be talking to what servers and what systems. And when it's an external threat actor, we have to have a really, really good threat intelligence process and collection method so that we can further contextualize that. For example, if we have a threat and you're running two threats in parallel as part of some surfaced hunt, and you have one that is known to maybe deploy adware and some slight crypto mining operation, and another one which 90% of the time is a ransomware as a service delivery. Well, I'm going to prioritize ransomware as a service because I'm probably going to be feeling that a lot harder on Friday than the crypto mining, which might take a few dollars out of the bottom line until I get to it.
I have a question for you. A lot of vendors make tools to solve technical control problems and visibility problems, but I think one of the things where products haven't been able to help, or at least I haven't found. So this is a question for delegates as well. If anyone has info to let me know. But how do you sort of do risk assessment on an enterprise or an organization? Risk assessment in the sense of where do you prioritize your efforts, time, and money? Is the CFO a more richer target than the IT guy? Do we spend more time digging through logs or pulling telemetry off of certain machines than others? If we can't do all equally. So how do you do that risk assessment? How do you prioritize?
So great question. And it's one of the problems that we're actively working on now, within, I guess, the constructs of XDR within Cisco. Recently we had the Kenna acquisition, which deals with a lot of risk and overlaying that information and data to, CVEs and vulnerability information. So when you really think about risk, there's multiple, I guess, domains, parallels, and kind of dimensions that you have to look at, have to ask yourself. Now, some of this is just algorithmic based, but outside of an organization, right, it can be rather, I guess, difficult to quantify that risk or adequately assign the risks to a variety of controls. But Ben just talked about XDR, and when you think about the premise of XDR, what it is, or at least one of the ways I view XDR is tighter integrations. And what those integrations allow us to achieve is more visibility that is connected within kind of this drive or push to do something. And that's measure that risk, enforce our existing controls. How do we best enable the defenders and make them more effective? So when we're thinking about risk, most organizations, they go after, hey, the executive suite is probably our, highest categorization of risk. But what happens if the same thing that just occurred also occurs on your domain controller, right? What happens when your next evolution of that threat is dumping credentials, and it's dumping those credentials on your domain controller? One of the easy ways to do this, well, I don't want to say easy because it's more conceptual, is using hidden Markov models, right? And then applying that level overlaid with some type of framework, whether it's your kill chain, whether it's your categorization that MITRE has, to then leverage those to identify nodes and where you are within an incident, within an attack, right? So you can then say, predictably, this is what's going to happen, and leverage that information to adjust the risk exposure that you actually have for that current incident or threat that you're investigating.
A lot of security teams put less emphasis on development environments, testing environments, especially for threat detection and everything. But one of my concerns there is so many organizations use production data as their test and their dev and test data. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So the question is, if I can repeat that back because I was struggling with my mute button, is I guess the importance or the criticality of utilizing in-field real-world data, right? And the potential impact that that's going to have when you're using maybe personally identifiable information, things like that for testing. So with that, our solution anyway is, when we're utilizing that data, what we have is scripts that go through and take and scrape out any personally identifiable information. So we know what fields and what commonalities are in our telemetry sources. So as we're developing against this, as we're testing that, we're ingesting some of that data where customers have authorized, our use of it, and we're anonymizing certain fields and or changing things to John Doe, Jane Doe, Jack, Jill, things like that. And a lot of those fields and information are really standardized. It gets a little gray when you start getting into file names, when you get into like Hulse, resume or, Hulse COVID test results .dox. That's where it starts getting into a gray area. But we try to minimize the reutilization of that, we try to minimize the availability and use of personally identifiable information within those telemetry streams through some levels of automation.
I wanted to know if you can briefly say how you would differentiate threat hunting, as you described it for Cisco, from threat intelligence.
So threat intelligence is actually the investigation into a threat or threat actor or a particular thing. So you're going to have a level of reverse engineering. You're going to go out there and say, what are their motives? And to start applying, multitude of labels, as well as investigating that threat actor's infrastructure even further. You're going to produce those tools, tactics, and procedures in more or less a dossier, right? And a digestible or even automated ingestion mechanism. So you have two things. One is the human readable output, i.e. a blog post, a bulletin, a PDF. And then you have the automated ingestion. Those are going to be your threat feeds and all your curated information. Threat hunting is really just the application of that data, extracted or abstracted out from the individual products. So, in many products, a lot of those things are put in, but there's always new insight, new information, new possibilities. Threat actors quite often have their own research teams. When a new version of Office comes out, they go through and find all of those mechanisms to exploit that, right? And then they're going to sell that on the web or sell that as these, as a service providers. Threat intelligence is going to say, hey, there's a new method, but not get into the specifics, right? Threat hunting research might dig in and come up with some of those hypotheses and say, how can we do this? How can this be done? What is the possibilities? And then go and actively apply that knowledge and apply any of the other tactics and tools and procedure lookups against our organization to find instances of that or variations of that.